Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns, and an unusual shot for our lead-in shot, but one of the most interesting sets of interviews we have had over the years, and we've had multiple interviews with certainly Justice Anderson, who's now retired from the Supreme Court, and Rick King, who's the COO legal of Thomson Reuters, is their individual interviews. Well, a little while ago, they got together and started doing what we would call joint interviews. They were really fascinating. Then they asked for an hour, which we rarely do. So here we are, we're going to do an hour.
An hour?
And
You think we can fill up an hour, Al?
I think you could fill up an hour saying hello.
Average works
And
out.
the fact of the matter is, this is really a precursor to a road show that they're going to take around the world. So we're really happy to.
I do want to compliment you on the quality of your guests. This is the first time that I've been on one of your TV shows with a younger version of the King in Waiting, Prince Albert of England. Do you notice that?
Well, there is a story to this, and maybe Rick King will tell us the story. And by the way, congratulations on your 2 new grandsons.
Thank you. Yeah, my daughter had them about a week ago, so they're all doing well.
Twins?
Twins.
Ooh.
Twin boys.
Two boys. So, yeah, my wife's having a birthday, one of those numbers that I'll let you guess about. But
Half of 80, probably.
Yeah, probably half my age.
she would like that. And next week we're going to England. We're going to spend time in a period house called Brockett Hall, and we're inviting a bunch of friends, and we're going back into the 19th century. So your Prince Albert part was very, very straight on there. So we're going to you have a lot of candles, have a country ball, do some shooting, and
you know what they used to refer to that era, particularly in French, la belle epoch, where you would gather and have these grand intellectual discussions about, you've got to come back and tell us about those intellectual discussions.
then
Absolutely. I think we're going to have the intellectual discussion today.
Shooting at hounds and things like
We're
that.
going to shoot at the clay pigeons, but
okay.
and then there's all kinds of things planned, and it should be fun. And so I'm going in character of a 19th century English gentleman. So I appreciate being Prince Albert.
I thought I was with
Because I
Prince
think
Albert.
his science and actually the beginning of the World's Fair, I think is quite intriguing, and one of the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, is always a popular visit for me when I'm
Paul
there.
Anderson just returned from China again, where he was on another teaching lecture tour, and I think it's in September that you're going to go, in the words of Herman Cain, to Uzbekistan.
Yes, Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
And at their invitation, interesting. So that's going to be fun.
So a lot of nation building you're doing here, rule of law.
Yeah, and may I just supplement something I've said on earlier shows. I mean, 4 weeks of teaching in China and seeing the juxtaposition of China and Japan or whatever, I've become to a more nuanced view of the rule of law. Rule of law is a necessary antecedent to democracy, for sure. That's the title of your show, Access to Democracy. But you need to tailor the rule of law to the particular culture and history of the country that you're working in. You can't, one cookie cutter version doesn't fit everywhere. It's quite a revealing insight that I've gained in my most recent travels.
And would that some of our politicians had the same insight, because when I listen to members of the Senate in particular talk about we're going to bring democracy to wherever it is, Iraq or any place else, and we see with the chaos today what kind of democracy we have brought to Iraq, they're thinking our type of democracy. Not everybody is ready for our type of democracy.
There are many types of democracy, but they have to have the antecedent of the rule of law, but the rule of law has some variations based upon the situation that you put it into. Can I tell you one story, how politicians have really messed things up?
How could we stop you?
Okay, so you know the great concern, and some of the neocons, and I'll say in particular, use the language we got to constrain or contain China. You know, worried about China. First of all, there's no way we can contain or constrain China. But the way the Chinese character and the language works is that when you use the word contain or constrain, the character that's used in Chinese translation is suppress. So if we were to hear the Chinese say, we got to suppress the United States, that's an antagonistic vocabulary. So we need to be careful what language use. We need to counterbalance China. We need to be able to build towards a partnership, but we don't want to contain or constrain if in fact it gets interpreted as suppress. Another example, Obama gets criticized for promoting multilateralism. I mean, we're going to have allies in whatever we do. So his response to the criticism is that he'll just say, well, but the United States will be a world leader for 100 years. We all can agree that we want the United States to be a world leader, and it should be and will be a world leader for 100 years. Gets translated into Chinese as the United States is going to rule the world for 100 years. That just gives their current autocratic government excuses to be nationalistic and anti-American, where the population really does believe in the American dream. It's a fascinating.
But the population is highly entrepreneurial.
Oh,
it's just becoming unearthed, so it's very interesting.
And in many ways, much more open than the Japanese. They'll do it their own way, and the explosion. But I mean, I visited with lawyers in China who recently won trademark cases for General Mills for the product Haagen-Dazs. You now get Haagen-Dazs in the Haagen-Dazs container.
Yeah.
And you can buy Minnetonka moccasins, the legitimate Minnetonka moccasins, because they went to the trademark high court in China and won cases. It's unbelievable 10 years ago that could happen.
So the WTO agreement when China joined was what, 95 was it?
Yeah.
So it's taken almost that long for some of those first cases, even though the intent with the WTO was that you have to do that.
Oh, can I tell you a nice story on the WTO and how this agreement? So there's this lawyer arguing a case on behalf of an international company trademark in the China's court, and the father of the current company on the other side is sitting in court. He's a high former government communist official. So the judge talks to the attorney representing the international company, said, you better settle this. There's no way I'm going to rule against the other side with the father sitting out there. And so the lawyer is very smart, and he says, well, but under the WTO and some of these provisions, I think this is a big issue. So I am going to raise this issue. If you tell me that this is the way the case is going to go and I should settle, I can't settle on behalf of my client, but I will make this an issue. And the judge's response, well, that makes the ground level now, doesn't it? and the attorney for the international corporation won, using the international agreements but you need to be smart on that, because they definitely have the insider's influence.
We also have to understand, and Rick can certainly speak to this because he visits so many countries in behalf of Thomson Reuters, but these are basically emerging countries, democracies in some case, but not our kind of democracy. And we have to really put that in perspective, and that's, I think, what our politicians fail to do.
So what's business? I mean, I don't envy you going into these international markets. By the way, they're not international anymore. The world is global.
Right.
You understand? And global is different from international. You tailor a product that's going to sell across all different countries. So how do you approach
Well,
that?
actually, more now, what we have to do is be in the emerging markets and actually build products in emerging markets, and then you back export them in a lot of cases to other emerging markets. A lot of people believe that when you are in a place like the U.S., when you're in a place like, let's say, the U.K., your thinking is constrained to the type of market you've been conditioned to, versus really thinking small, how quickly you can get it in there, and those types of things.
That's internationalism, isn't it?
That is, where you take your product that you make and go, well, if I change the language and the interface and this and that, and I can then sell it around the world, right? And I add different content and different, no. What we need to do is go sit in their world with the nationals there and understand what they need to do. And if they can take anything that we've done and build upon it, great. But they need something that fits their needs at their time. Typically, what we can do for our products is, if we can run data centers or something like that for them, that's better. But if they need to build a product for, let's say, the legal profession, it's going to be quite different in terms of what they need in China than it is in the U.S.
But the interesting thing about it is they build it for this other market, this other global market. They create a global product that you then will, is more than likely not bring it back here.
Absolutely.
It's developed globally, but it comes back here, and we are now the consumers of this global product.
That's a tremendous challenge, though, to the manufacturer or to the creator of these systems, having to deal with all these different facets.
But it's very powerful to unlock those markets. So a lot of people spend a lot of time, sending people from wherever your mothership is to these markets to try to understand enough to bring back this information. When if you can get the people in the market to join your business and understand what you're trying to do, they can put the local touch on it, and they have a much better connection to what should be done. So we need to do quite a bit more of that, and they also still have to have the view that you don't need to reinvent everything. So what's the trick is use the power of a bigger company, use the things that you can, but tailor it for your market, and then it does have export potential for them. This is something we couldn't do with manufacturing as easily because of the capital required to get going, right? You didn't really want to manufacture everywhere, but if you're building software products, the manufacturing cost is the people, the intellectual people. It really doesn't matter where they are. You're paying roughly the same thing. So you don't get those economies of scale. You get the ones when you start having bricks and mortar and things like
Now,
that.
I want to ask a question that's been bugging me.
Uh-oh.
You now become a global company. Where does your loyalty lie? Now, I'm going to give you a thing. You see, in China and other places, I have learned that they appreciate the soundness, the quality of the governmental rule of law base that the United States provides. And so many of the operations function under the umbrella of the United States and whatever. But these companies' loyalty is not to the United States anymore. It's a global loyalty. And I get kind of ticked that the companies take advantage of the template, the solid business template that the United States provides, but they aren't loyal to or willing to pay for that system that they so much want to use. I saw some of that in China.
Well, it's true. Let's talk about Thomson Reuters. So it's actually a Canadian company, and it has dominant presence in the
By the
United
way,
States.
the Canadian ambassador gave Thomson Reuters a nice shout-out. He
And we
said something
appreciate
about
that.
the Winnipeg Jets.
Yeah, the Winnipeg Jets are owned by the owner family of Thomson, David Thomson, and their investment firm. But
Where's your loyalty when they play the Wolves?
I'm
They being the Jets?
totally on the totally on the Wild. No, totally on the Wild.
Oh, Wild, yeah, the
Yeah,
Wild.
totally on the Wild. There's no question about that. But that's an easy call. There's other ones that are more difficult. But I think in a global world, and let's be honest, and this will get into another topic that you want quickly, companies. If you look at the company versus the country, the company's owned by shareholders, so the company has to deliver what the mission is for the shareholders, which is going to be, and the other stakeholders. So there's return on investment, there's the things for the stakeholders like the jobs and careers and things for people, whatever they define themselves as, but mostly shareholders are looking for financial return. That's why they're investing in the company. Doesn't matter where they live, they invest in the company. Doesn't matter where the company is headquartered. The benefit that the U.S. has always provided was that there are enough rules that people thought when you invest in that company, you're not going to be hoodwinked by and large out of your money. You may not pick a winner, or you might. That'll be up to your own skill and some bit of luck, right? But you're not going to be manipulated out of things
We have
by
the
and
rules of the
large.
game here, don't we?
So that's pretty good. Now, there's certainly some examples we've had in the financial industry of late that we're not 100%, but other places, as you well know, are much more tilted tables when you look at, do you invest in that country? Sometimes it's a national investment. Sometimes it's a company in a country, and whether you can rely on it. And one of the global impacts that we always have to think about is, think about this, we've got 52,000 people worldwide. They're all over the place, about 20% in Asia, or 25% in Asia, 25% in Europe, and about 50% in the Americas. So they're all over the place. You know that in each one of these 140 countries or so that we have people in, the rules of behavior, business-wise, are totally different.
Absolutely.
And we assume that they are our rules, whatever that is. Well, other countries, paying somebody for access to something in a very direct manner is not that unusual.
That's the part of
Right.
that is the arrogance of the Americans, really, as seen by other people, that we just assume that everybody plays by our rules.
True. So what we say is we have a code of conduct as a Canadian company. This is the code. If you work for us, no matter what country you're in, this is what we abide by. Now, we're not making a judgment that this is right or wrong, whatever your local thing, but to be with us, which is your choice, you have to abide by these. Those are the kind of things that we have to deal with, because otherwise some of the local practices vary quite a bit.
Quite a bit. I'm talking to a lawyer in China. They have no rule of confidentiality between client and lawyer in China. And so now, to
And in
litigate
other
it-
places as
yeah,
well.
To litigate
Yeah.
a trademark thing, you have to first go through probably an American law firm, but to litigate it, you have to hire a Chinese lawyer
Right.
who is not bound by the same ethical rules that American lawyers are. And the American lawyer is that if he violates the ethical rules, he's going to be disciplined, but he's got somebody he's hiring that doesn't care a whit about those ethical rules.
And that's the interesting nature of the global conflict, right? And so if you're that U.S. law firm or, Western Europe law firm hiring the law firm in China, you need to know that, and you need to figure out how do we deal with that, right? That's because you can't get around that. That's just the way it is.
It's also affecting us in another way. There is so much out of the United States in terms of corporation and investment that's coming into our corporations and our companies, and that also changes the playing field.
Oh, the Chinese owned billions of dollars of American bonds, which don't pay much interest. Now, China is primed to bring that money back into the United States and start buying up. I mean, Thomson Reuters might look like a good buy to some Chinese entity. And, a year from now, I could be sitting next to somebody who's explaining, he said, why did you sell out to China? Well, they got the money. And if your only responsibility is the shareholder and shareholder price, you might sell. But isn't there that's the Chicago School of Economics. Management is solely obligated to the shareholder. But you said something very interesting. You talked about employees. So where does the obligation of the top leadership go beyond just the bottom line?
Yeah, I think the top leadership has an obligation to the other stakeholders, the customers, the employees, and so forth, but also to the shareholders. But your owners, and in our case, we have a majority owner who's it's owned by a family corporation. So David Thompson's the chairman. They own over 50%. So if you had a company like ours who had Chinese money, wanted to buy it, they have to say yes or no. That's totally up to them. So they could say they could defend themselves against the minority shareholders if in fact the Chinese said, for example, a Chinese firm said, we're going to buy you, and it's for 10 times what your current market value is.
See, this is a real world. I mean, Australia.
Then the shareholders would go like, wow, what a return. You must do this, right? And
the family says, no, we're not interested in doing that.
The family might say, we don't want to do that. So that's an interesting scenario. We see that live right now with IBM and Lenovo trying to sell. They've sold the PC business already to Lenovo, which is a Chinese firm. Now they want to sell the server business. Well, because the server business is so involved in a lot of U.S. government activities and integral to business in the United States, it's under review by the United States government. And the question is going to be whether the government will actually allow the Chinese to buy that from IBM because of what they might perceive as security risks in these server businesses. So this is where we get into some really interesting things.
These are real world problems. The Chinese are buying up New Zealand, Australia, and maybe they're coming your way.
They
need places to park the money.
Economy. They are the burgeoning economy in the world right now.
He said something that Rick said, right? They need places to put the money. The return on the Treasury bill is not enough anymore, and so they're going to invest someplace.
Yeah, and there's wild. The place you would really see these things first, I think, is when you go on some typical places on vacation. When you start seeing a lot of visitors from China, then all of a sudden you'll see a lot of property buys from China. They'll own the hotels. They'll buy a lot of the private islands. I think the investments in places like Hawaii will be quite interesting.
Try Paris. I mean, we just got back last week, and there are large groups of Chinese visitors, and they're being led by Chinese interpreters and guides, and it was really fascinating. A few years ago, it was Japanese. Yep. Particularly in this country, but now it's Chinese.
By the way, we should, because we've said something politically, I think you would probably agree with this, but I don't know. There's nothing wrong with the pursuit of a place to park their money.
No,
at all.
Perfectly.
And in a way, we should be honored that this is a place they think is secure and good
and
to put your money,
yes.
right?
I was thinking
it does call in a lot of these issues, doesn't it?
I was thinking of making myself a corporation and see if some Chinese investor wants to buy my corporation.
But my mind is virtually exploding with information coming back from China, and this is just one facet of it. And I think of the challenges that you face as the top management and leadership of a company that is involved not only in the global market, but having to deal with these issues. And how do you get the information to make the right decisions? I mean, you've got to be informed.
Well, I guess the analogy I would use is boots on the ground. You need people in the theater that you're dealing with that you can rely on. And we have some really great people around the world in some of these places, and when we've bungled up going to a new geography, it's usually been because we thought, some textbook, some Harvard Business Review case, we had a approach we thought would work. The approach has got to be to get really strong local presence that you can rely on, trust, and understand what your mission is, and buy into your mission, and they're part of it.
And people have to understand as well, it goes two ways. They have to understand your mission, you have to understand
Absolutely.
their mission.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
it becomes a very sensitive issue. And you say boots on the ground, I immediately think of John McCain, ready to put
let's not
soldiers
go
on
there.
the ground.
But you did touch on one of my pet peeves. The diminishment of the middle class in the United States, which has been very critical, that template of doing business, having that middle class is so critical. But the spread between the mean compensation for the employee of a company and executive CEO compensation, I think it's out of line. Now, I can make economic arguments about that. I can make ethical and moral arguments. But I'm going to try a new one out on you that I've come back from China that's just, is that what I'm seeing is that in many cases we aren't getting what we're paying for. We're not getting the vision, we're not getting the long-term investment. See, we can compete with China. I mean, I'm not willing to cede that ground, but we can't waste a single mind, we can't waste a single person here in our country, and I don't see the business leadership providing us with that. It's too much, weekly, daily, hourly stock price, and it's not the vision and the investment in the future. I mean, you're part of that culture.
It's not just the business leadership, though. It's the political leadership. One of the things that I feel that we have really let slack is education and emphasis on education in this country. And it used to be that we stood heads and shoulders above everybody. That's not the case anymore. And we're not educating our young people to the degree that we have to really compete in this world economy.
Not that we're
Or
picking
global
on you,
economy.
sir, but we're looking for a response.
Well, I could easily say that ever since the federal government totally entered the education world, it's gone downhill. There is a correlation. I'm not sure it's exactly the science, but I remember the day when we had the chapter funds, and pretty much that was it. There was a lot of supplemental money coming in, but education was very localized, and people took great pride in what they did with that in their communities. Somehow we've lost that,
certainly have.
somehow locally those things, they're not making the cases for the right things. But if you take the state of Minnesota, you can correct me, there's over 400 school districts, and a lot of them have the typical administration and so forth, and I just think you've got to look at how to balance some of these things. You don't need as much administration over a wide variety of people. Perhaps that could be 200 school districts, and all of a sudden you're spending less on administration and you spend more on education.
Now, I will see that point
Absolutely.
too. We have standardized tests, standard regulations, and we dummied down those who would stand out and be the leaders. So we got to eliminate.
So
some-
that's the point there.
Even in higher education, Minsk with 32 schools has 32 presidents. We have a chancellor, and each of those presidents has, and I can speak for at least one school, top-heavy, with vice presidents and things like that. Absolutely duplication, absolutely. The people who are making the money are not the people who should be really making the money for the teaching. It's wrapped up in administration, and it's a very dangerous precedent.
Well, I think it's also, in that case, I think I agree with you there. I think we could do a lot better consolidation. I think it's also an old model in the higher ed, particularly in Minnesota, about facilities and where they need to be located and so forth.
No,
'Cause I
you're
think
disagreeing. Every Senate district should have a community college.
Well, that, and that's back in the time of Prince Albert, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I think we got to look at these things differently. When I look at the bonding bills, they come in year after year for more to keep the education institutions in the bricks and mortar. And I'd like to see that money turned into stuff for education and students and tuition control and things that get the best teachers and people more access to classroom.
But you're touching, I mean, that's a delicate issue, because the population in outstate Minnesota, particularly northern Minnesota, is decreasing. You're saying that, well, with that decrease in population, we maybe have too much bricks and mortar outstate, and we should put the money otherwise?
Yes, I am.
You're going to lose your election. Oh, you aren't elected.
No, but I would say that even if their population was fixed, I think we have to look at, and it's not, the metro areas don't get more bricks and mortar because they're the metro area. We've got to reduce it across the board. There are different ways we can educate people today, and I'm not saying we're totally online, I'm not saying that at all, but we can mix a lot more things together and do it right. Let's take our money and figure out how to put it into instruction and getting people into the venture, rather than, you know, the physical facility and the administration of the facilities.
And I think in this...
I'm going to answer your question.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you out the hook either, sir.
In this IT world, it's important that our students learn as much about the new technology. But at the same time, I see, definitely in the classroom, that we are losing something by students not knowing history, by students not really being schooled in the social sciences and the humanities. And I think that as we have swept into the intelligence technology, that we're making a big mistake in not seeing that we have emphasis in those things that are so important.
Do you mean the governors of Florida, Texas, and Kentucky are wrong when they say they will no longer support a quote-unquote liberal education? The type of education that teaches us history, teaches us to write, to think, and analyze?
Well, among other things, they won't even accept the theories of evolution. So
we won't go there. I'm just saying is that we need to have that broad. See, you can teach, and you got your technology.
Left brain and right brain.
Yeah.
So the argument has been put forth about STEM education, and when people do that to the max, you're forgetting that the best problem solvers approach problems from different angles.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, I think you have to have the combination of the classical education and the contemporary technology kind
Absolutely.
of education. It's not that we need this or that we should revert to that, it's that we need both. And those are the people that are going to be the best to approach today's problem.
I hope your audience listens to that answer, because Rick has just given the answer to why the United States in the past has continued to be a world leader. Because we have taught our citizens that very thing. The best problem solvers are integrated. See, and China's getting better on this, but they have a great education system that kind of combines the thinking to silos. And in my third trip now, I'm finding they're connecting.
Still a little bit more rote, too.
Yes, they're a little bit more, but they're connecting the silos a whole lot better. We've done that in the past, and we don't continue to do that, we'll lose. But if we keep it, we keep our advantage.
I see hope as we move toward these common core principles versus where we've been. I'm not saying the common core is the solution, but it's an upgrade of the standards but the day we're satisfied with minimum standards is which we have been for a long time, is really a sad day. We should be well advanced beyond that. But you know,
do minimum standards dummy down the rest? Bring everybody
down? They don't have to.
They don't have to.
No, I think it just it's tugging along the bottom, making sure people don't fall through what everybody likes to call it. It's another social safety net. Nope, got to meet at least that much. But the day that's taking all our focus, we miss making sure we've got the best and brightest doing the best, and we miss that big chunk in the middle where the best and brightest may emerge.
And that's what really worries me about that big chunk in the middle, as you describe it.
It's always the ones that get left, right?
Those are the ones that are getting left behind.
Well, and that gets back to economic question
Yes,
about
I think-
wage, right?
Are we getting
Which I
what we
don't-
pay for?
Which I don't, no, we're not. Generally speaking, we're not. I agree with you, you're right. You finally found a way to frame it that we can actually easily agree, because it is about results. But I want to say about this, I think the wage of a lot of corporate America's top leaders is unbelievably large, and it surprises me a lot, and it actually disappoints me. I don't have a way to deal with that, except I do wonder, when is enough enough? I don't think there's a way to, I don't have a way to fix that, but I do worry about that. And I am concerned about the minimum side as well. And then I think that the vast differences are really difficult for people to deal with. And I believe that our country, when you think about it, if you use the economic data of just what the 1% and above earn, which I think is $200,000, or maybe the 1% of the 125 anyway, but it's above that amount. The vast majority then, 99% of the voters are below that, right? So the real power is in all of these people deciding that they want a bigger stake in this game and getting involved.
Oh, but no, the Supreme
in
Court
the
has
process.
decided that. Corporations are people, and they can contribute as much as they want
Sure.
anonymously. So they've tipped the balance.
No,
in
they
the-
didn't. They corrected an imbalance because the labor unions could have already done that before. When you let the labor unions do it and you don't let the companies do it, is that right?
No, it's just that the corporate structure has taken that model and has done it so much better than is that they have distorted that.
I could live with both of them being
40
pulled
years
out.
ago, though, 40% of the working population were unionized, were in the labor movement. Today, it's down to about 12%, and that's conscious by actually the industries working to do away with the unions. And I think that when the unions were more powerful, we had a much more powerful country.
Well, I want to take a little issue with that. I think part of the union's self-destruction was indeed self. They were not just fought. It's natural that you're going to have a tension in the groups, but a lot of the activities that they did, once we reached, there was probably a time when we reached a balance that was right. So when either side goes way off the deep end in the balance, you're going to get a correction. The unions have, in the last few years, faced the correction of the things where they took on and went too far. And before that, if you want to call it the management or the companies, did the same thing. And if we can stop when we have a decent balance, then I think we would probably have a better set of
And
living
are we ever
principles.
going to be able to stop that?
Is it like the
Are we
pendulum where it
ever
finally
going to
comes?
be able to come back? People vote against their own self-interest. If it was up to Rand Paul, and he actually says a lot of things that I agree with, but he would just do away with all regulation. I think regulation has been one of the factors that has helped us become great. And as regulation has fallen in industry, in the airline industry, in the banking industry, I think we have really done some very destructive things.
One of the advantages of being old or older is you've been around for the discussion. In the 70s,
You're not old yet.
Yeah, not
I'm
in the
old.
70s and 80s, I was talking to business, and I said, you're getting your clock cleaned by labor because you are not exercising the political muscle that you can, and you don't know how, you're so naive. So I was part of the discussions of talking about how business can counterbalance. The problem is that, labor leadership, you're right, became too establishment-oriented, too protective of what they have, and maybe myopic in looking at the future. Business model took over the playing field, and now has even done a way better job than labor in taking it over and using the money and the resources which they have. So it's grossly out of balance. And so I worry about the future of our democracy. And there's where you should ask me the question about the election of Eric Cantor, and maybe Rick and I have some different views on why that happened.
Well, certainly number one is the fact that he disconnected from his group.
Yep.
He disconnected from his voters. He was rarely there. He didn't even live in the district anymore. And he made these showcase visits every once in a while this fellow who, what was his name, Burke or something
Right.
like
I think Minnesota
ran-
Connections, by the way.
ran against him, really, talking about put boots on the ground, really worked all the local areas. So there's a little bit of arrogance there and a little bit of lack of political reality there.
Well, here's the way I analyze it, is that they make a big point about the Tea Party's role in that race. Surely the Tea Party had a presence, but it wasn't the Tea Party presence that, to my mind, tipped that race. And is that to the extent that the Tea Party, but Bratt in particular, identified issues, they got it half right. They're wrong on the immigration issue. That's Karl Rove wants to block any immigration reform for fear of reducing the Caucasian voting base in the United States, because you get immigration reform, you're going to get more Latinos, they tend to vote. But where the big issue that people are missing is the political corruption issue. If you look at Representative Cantor, he was so tied to the business issues, the Wall Street issues, and the insider business things that really do only benefit the 1%. And Bratt was very good at citing is that, well, this reform was proposed, Cantor blocked it. This reform was proposed, Cantor blocked it. Meaningful financial reform, Cantor had sold out to the establishment, the business establishment. Now this gets back to you're talking about, if the people get the message, maybe they will vote. The people got that message. So it's not Tea Party,
Well,
it's the issue that
In addition to that, I believe they had crossover voting in that state, which means that you can vote for anybody, much the same, I guess, as we have in this state. And not in New York, where I came from originally. In New York, if you're a registered Democrat, you can only vote in the Democratic primary. We just saw that in, where was it?
Mississippi.
Mississippi Chad Cochran race.
Right.
Yeah.
Who won that election for him? Black voters who are normally Democratic voters, and that crossover. So I think that same thing
But that
happened to
doesn't
Cantor.
explain it all, because the people depicted Bratt as more conservative than Cantor. I think if you look at that race and there was this growing discontent with selling out.
But they say, who would we rather run against in November?
Well, that
run against
district
Bratt
is so
or-
Republican that the Republicans will win.
Or Cantor. Well,
Yeah.
if the Democrats
But
have
I
any
think
chance.
there is a seed of the people, and that's one of the messages of the Tea Party, which I disagree with them on most issues, but they really do identify this issue. The people are dissatisfied with both parties about the insider being
Yeah,
bought.
and I think it plays into your disconnection from the district point, which is true. So when you take on, I don't know why, if you were going to be a congressional leader, that you would want to be in the leadership versus a committee chair. I really don't. Those jobs are all about recruiting candidates, amassing funds, and you got to go where the money is. So it's all around, and you're totally disconnected from your voter base most of the time. Now, Cantor, I would have, Boehner, I would have thought you could get disconnected from your district pretty easily because you have to be gone a lot. Cantor in Virginia, it's like he's home. He could be home a lot, but he just didn't pay attention because you start believing that you're invulnerable.
He was in everybody else's home, but not his own.
And raising money.
He was raising a ton of money in
He
his
certainly
leadership PAC. I can't remember the name of it. The Congressional Leadership PAC that he runs is very well funded. I mean, he was getting good he was doing his job as a leader. But your job as a leader and your job as the congressman from your district are very in conflict quite often, and I think that's what gets those discontent. And then you know, to be that person in that role in that current house, you have to be aligned with business, And if you don't treat that alignment carefully, you get this voter backlash because it's a very interesting
Yeah,
thing.
and it shows again, and I don't like using the corrupting influence of too much money and too much money nationally. And that's what Cantor was involved in and brought him outside of his district and caused his opponent to be able to say, well, he's doing this, he's doing that, and isolate him.
It makes you, I think, very vulnerable. And you're right. So I would love to see a way where we don't have all that money. And so you said earlier, the corporations, I'd like to see all of those out. I'd like to see the whole thing devalued. Of course, the advertising companies would like to shoot me, but
Britain has done it.
$20 million for a Senate campaign is nothing. I mean, that's like a state with no population in it.
And I'm looking at a TV, the TV, they depend on those ads, and they aren't going to let the reform come.
6 weeks of campaigning, no lobbyists, which takes lobbyists out of the situation of writing the legislation that benefits themselves. But can we ever get there? I don't know, because we are so entrenched in this corrupt system now. I wonder if we can ever get there
So
again.
is this the form of democracy that we're shipping around? Is that back to your point about?
Now, you say that with a smile,
Well, I
but
do-
that
That's
is
a
a
good point,
very,
yes.
very
It's a cogent
insightful
point.
comment, is that what form of democracy? See, I sat in at a panel in Tunisia when they're designing the new constitution, and they cited our constitution as the quintessential document that talking about the principles, but they were looking at the German constitution for the model to the constitution. So the principles in our constitution are held up as almost an icon, but they don't like exactly how we do it sometimes.
The, the implementation is
Well, it's
different.
it's a brilliant document that needs a lot around it to make it actually function. And the interpretation, you spend a good number of years interpreting the words of smart people, and how do you do that? How do you actually, when you really have that constitutional question, and in the state, one of the authors of the state constitution, how do you get in that character about what they actually intended?
You start with a minimum template. You got to do justice. You elevate that is that you got to use common sense as you figure out what is the right thing to do. And here's where Justice Scalia and I disagree. He says you can figure out what the founders wanted to do with internet searches based in 1787. I say no. The Constitution is flexible enough to wrap itself around these modern problems, but it doesn't exactly address them. And so it's got to be a living document.
The Constitution is a template, but it has to change with the times. It
has to adjust with the times.
Right.
You don't change the words necessarily.
Well, adjust, change.
Yeah.
Second Amendment is a perfect example of that. And look what we're going through today with the Second Amendment and 38,000 deaths by handgun
I
a
would say
year.
the Second Amendment is so let's do first and second in comparison. Second Amendment's quite a bit more ambiguous in the wording that's chosen. The First Amendment is much more clear in its wording, right? So the interpretation of the First Amendment has followed a pretty carefully crafted
We saw that
protection,
yesterday
right?
in the decision on abortion clinics.
And what those words actually mean in the Second Amendment, and because the construction is very convoluted, how we interpret it, if I could do anything, I'd tell them, what did you really mean about that? Because there's a lot of dissension.
And the Fourth Amendment, another case that came down this week, telephone privacy, cell phone privacy, unreasonable search and seizure. Again, the ambiguity with the words that you find in the Second Amendment, more nuanced interpretation.
That surprised me, that decision. But then I realized that all the Supreme Court judges have cell phones now.
Thank God they do, right?
Well, I ran into my daughter had twin grandsons a week ago, and so I was at their hospital. I was talking to this intensive care nurse, and she said, "Do you want to take some pictures?" Because the kids were a little bit small, so they were intensive care. So I take my picture with my iPhone, and so I punch in the number for the code, And I handed it to her, and she says, you should never use a code on your phone. And I said, you should always use a code on your phone, a security code. She says, no, how many people have we had come in the emergency room, and the only way I can contact their next of kin, because they don't have ID or whatever, is to pull out their cell phone and try to find somebody on there to get in touch with. And if there's a code and you're not conscious, I'm not going to be able to do that. And I thought, with the decision by the Supreme Court, I was thinking, wow, this is now, it's really interesting.
Can I add a nuance? I know we're running out of time, but
we're in great
I bought
shape.
a low-end computer because I was advised not to take my main computer. I won't give it. I'm a Mac user. I had a Mac Air. Don't bring it; they'll mess it up. So I bought a cheap computer. Within 2 days,
We're going to ask Avi about that.
they
He'll
had
tell you.
infected my computer with a virus. I lost the screen. Predictably, I took it to a dealer to try and figure out what could it do. They couldn't do anything, but they had completely downloaded everything I had on the computer, got all my information, and my computer was disabled. I knew I was monitored. I talked to a student, we were going to lunch, he said, aren't you going to take your computer here out of the library? Don't you dare leave it? I said, oh, there are cameras all around here. Nobody would dare take my computer because we would know who did it. And I initially was rejecting that surveillance. It was amazing to me how soon I gave up. They said, okay, you're going to monitor everything I do, you're going to monitor my lectures, you're going to do... It's frightening me how quickly I gave up. And which goes back to that opinion by the United States Supreme Court this week. Thank God for that opinion, because they said we aren't giving up. We are going to honor some privacy, and that's why I love this country. You know, I really do. You know, is that there's so much we got going for ourselves here. And as much as I disagree with the jurisprudence coming out of the Supreme Court, when the rubber hit the road on that one, they said we have limits and we're going to draw the line.
And I do believe that they looked at their own personalities and their own lives, and that had part of part of the reasoning.
Boots on the ground,
right
as
there.
you said, right?
Yep, it helps if your feet are in the issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so much removed. Well, we haven't talked about 9/10 of what I thought we were
We
going to
aren't
have
out
to
of
talk
time yet,
about.
are we?
We have 6 minutes left
What's your favorite topic?
out of an hour.
Oh, I mean, I would defer to you, sir.
Well, I was very interested to hear your view on China as it emerged, because you've gone back
This is my third visit.
numerous times now, and what have you seen as the biggest change from the first time to the most recent time?
Oh, first of all, let me caution you. If anybody goes to China and comes back and tells you they're going to explain China to you, you might as well shut down, because they don't know what they're talking about. I can only provide you with anecdotes and experiences that I have. The change is more dynamic now than it was in 2008. 2011 it was more. The electricity, the thing that's going on, particularly in the education scene, is tremendous. In the last, I think it's either decade and a half or 2 decades, China has raised 220 million people out of poverty. That allows the current government to stay in power, because they've made life better for so many that people are saying...
They have $1.2 billion, is that?
$1.3 billion. There's still 800,000 or 800 million still suffering from poverty, but they have raised the standard so much. People don't want... They don't like the government.
Do they trust the government?
No, not at all. Oh, they don't.
They're getting like us.
But then,
Well, we get, like what you said, after how many days you just got used to that you were being observed.
And they're concerned about what the alternative is. And is that...
As we should be also.
And see, by the way, I went into shopping malls that would blow away anything you can see here in Minnesota. Now, the Chinese like to come to our malls, but don't be mistaken, because they're so fancy and they have... The prices are half to 2/3 of what name brand products are, so they want to buy the products at a lower cost. But I was in one mall, and my interpreter and I went up to the guard and said, please show me a Caucasian. I want to see, because they were all Chinese. And so, I mean, it was, you had comparable to Caribou Coffee, you had Godiva chocolates, Louis Vuitton. The kids had a demonstration on Legos. Oh, and the one Caucasian couple I ran into, he was from Sweden, Gutenberg. Geely, a Chinese car manufacturer, just bought out Volvo. So Volvos now are going to be under the control of a Chinese manufacturer. Now, I was talking to a Volvo dealer in Minnesota and said, "Are you worried about Geely? They don't have a terribly good name in China." They said, "Well, they want Volvo because we bring the expertise." And they said, "By the way, when Ford, an American company, owned Volvo, they virtually raped the company." So that's where I come back to this. Are we getting what we're paying for in our leadership?
Now, as a Volvo owner, I'm watching this very closely because I was aware of this.
The guy from Minnesota is a very powerful. He says he has confidence what Geely is going to do. Instead of bring Volvo down to what Geely standards,
You're going to bring them up.
They bought the company to bring the company standards up to the Volvo standard, and they're keeping the Volvo name separate. I mean, they're being smart about it, and but this is the change.
So that's the leadership thing that you posed earlier, is that I think some people are really good leaders. It has nothing to do with what they get paid. Other people are not so good in their approach, and they get paid what they get paid, and the people that get judged the best are the ones that do the best, and usually they're not always the highest paid. It just turns out that way.
Yeah, but the leadership in my mind, and I don't mean to pick on it, is so much too internalized. They talk to each other too much. They justify what they do because they don't, as you said, put enough boots on the ground. They don't put their finger to
The ones that are doing the best.
One of you said, "How much is enough?" And I think it was you,
Yeah,
Rick.
I did.
And that is one of the problems right now. How much is enough? What do you need? If you can take care of yourself and your family and maybe the next generation, is that enough? That should be enough. But
I need
this
enough to
drive-
get past through security at the airport, and maybe that's not enough. I need my private jet because then I can avoid that whole scenario completely. So, I mean, it's a complicated question. What is enough, isn't it?
True, it's hard to figure it out, but between the what is enough and the companies that have failed when they put some kind of ratio between the lowest paid worker and the highest, rigid rules don't always solve the problem. We need to have some good judgment and by good people.
That's why I want to reframe the issue to said, are we getting what we pay for?
And my
it
answer
comes
is
down
no,
and it comes down
in a
to
lot of
accountability.
cases.
So
Yep.
you ask that question, and is it just the bottom line short-term stock price, or are you saving us for the future?
one of the most fascinating things for me is when we get the two of you together and we go an hour, and the hour is gone now. And I really want to thank Rick King and Paul Anderson,
See,
the Honorable Paul Anderson.
We replicated la belle epoch. We're dealing with ideas, right?
We love that.
we
It's
love
always
that,
good
don't
to
you?
talk with you.
Yes,
Sit
it
with
is.
you, it's an honor.
Such a pleasure to have the two
Thanks,
of you
Alan.
here, and thank you again. both
Thank
of
you.